The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Russo family mansion in Naples, a city where power whispered through marble corridors, and old money spoke louder than words. Outside, the Tyrrhenian Sea crashed against the cliffs, indifferent to the weight of human ambition that pressed down upon the streets below. Elena Russo stood in the kitchen of her family's estate, her hands submerged in warm soapy water, watching through the open doorway as her mother slept peacefully in the adjacent room. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, casting soft shadows across Maria Russo's face. At 63, Maria looked fragile, as if the years of raising 3 daughters alone had slowly dissolved her bones into something translucent and breakable. Elena's father had abandoned them when she was barely 3 years old, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken promises. Elena dried her hands on a worn linen towel and moved silently toward her mother's room, checking the medication bottles arranged on the nightstand like soldiers standing guard. Diabetes, high blood pressure, early-stage kidney disease, the alphabet of aging that no one in their family wanted to acknowledge. She adjusted her mother's blanket, smoothed a strand of silver hair from her forehead, and whispered something only the universe could hear. In the living room, the walls held evidence of a different reality. Photographs of her 2 older sisters covered every available surface, each frame a monument to a life Elena would never live. Gabriella, 32, married to Marco Venturi, a billionaire real estate developer whose name appeared in financial newspapers with the frequency of saints in a cathedral. Their wedding had been featured in Italian Vogue. The photograph showed Gabriella radiant in a custom Valentino gown, stepping out of a Bentley, her diamond engagement ring catching the light like a small constellation. Next to it, Alessia, 29, smiled from her own shrine of success. She had married Antonio Moretti, a tech entrepreneur whose startups had revolutionized digital payments across Europe. Their penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a building in Milan. Alessia's wedding invitation had been hand-delivered by courier, embossed in gold leaf, a physical manifestation of wealth that Elena had held in her hands for only a moment before carefully placing it on the mantel. Elena was 26. She had never worn a wedding dress. She had never had a photograph in Vogue. The most recent picture of her, taken 3 years ago at Gabriella's wedding, showed her in a modest navy blue dress, standing slightly to the left of the frame, her smile polite but distant, as if she were already fading from the image before the photographer's flash had even captured her. She moved through the mansion like a ghost who still remembered what it felt like to be alive. Her bedroom was on the 3rd floor, a small space that had once been a storage room, converted into quarters when their father left and money became tight. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the single window looked out onto the service courtyard where delivery trucks arrived with supplies. She had decorated the space herself over the years. Watercolor paintings she had created of Neapolitan streets hung beside pressed flowers she had collected during walks through the city gardens. These paintings were her language, the only way she knew how to speak without words. That afternoon, Gabriella called. Elena recognized her sister's voice immediately, that particular blend of enthusiasm and obligation that suggested she was calling during a gap between social commitments. Elena listened as her sister spoke, not really listening, more like existing in the space between Gabriella's words. There was going to be an engagement party. Gabriella's best friend, Vittoria, was marrying someone important, someone powerful. The event would be held at the Capodimonte Museum after hours, a private venue that suggested the kind of wealth that could purchase history itself. The guest list would include Naples' most influential families, politicians, businessmen, and their wives, who understood that social standing was measured in the weight of one's jewelry and the exclusivity of one's invitations. Elena was invited, of course, she was family, but the invitation came with an unspoken instruction: be present, but not prominent. Smile, but do not overshadow. Attend, but do not draw attention. Elena had mastered this role so completely that sometimes she wondered if she had become entirely transparent. She hung up the phone and looked at her reflection in the mirror above her dresser. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders in loose waves. She had never had the patience for the elaborate styling her sisters preferred. Her eyes were a deep brown, the same color as her mother's, holding in them a kindness that the world had learned to overlook. She was beautiful, perhaps, in a way that suggested depth rather than declaration. But depth was not valued in the world her sisters inhabited. That evening, Elena sat beside her mother's bed, reading to her from a book of Neapolitan poetry. Maria's eyes closed, as Elena's voice moved through the verses, each word a small comfort in the gathering darkness. Her mother's hand rested on the blanket, and Elena reached over and held it gently, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the thin skin. This was her life. This was her choice. This was her invisible crown. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Naples, on the narrow streets where history lived in the architecture, on the Bay of Naples where ancient Pompeii lay buried beneath ash and time. Somewhere in the city, in penthouses and palaces, Elena's sisters were preparing for their glittering lives, and Elena remained in her small room on the third floor, painting watercolors of streets she loved, caring for a mother whose illness had become the central axis around which her entire world rotated. She did not know that in 3 weeks at the engagement party at the Capodimonte Museum, her invisible life was about to become impossible to ignore. She did not know that fate, which had seemed to forget her entirely, was about to remember her name with a force that would shake the foundations of everything her family believed about power, worth, and love. She simply held her mother's hand and read poetry into the gathering night, unaware that her story, the real one, the one that mattered, was about to begin. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in front of her wardrobe, a modest collection of dresses that reflected her life rather than proclaimed it. She had nothing that screamed elegance. She had nothing that whispered power. She had nothing that belonged in a museum after hours, surrounded by Naples' most influential families. What she had were practical clothes, functional and understated, the uniform of someone who had learned to disappear into the background of other people's lives. She finally selected a simple charcoal gray dress, modest in cut but elegant in its simplicity. She wore it with pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, small, refined, the kind of jewelry that spoke of history rather than expense. She pulled her hair into a soft updo, applied minimal makeup, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like someone attending a party. She did not look like someone who belonged there. The Capodimonte Museum was luminous in the evening light. Its gardens spread across the hilltop like a crown, and inside, the masterpieces of Renaissance painters watched silently as Naples' elite moved through the rooms. Frescoes and portraits created an atmosphere of refined wealth, the kind that could only be achieved when generations of money allowed for appreciation of art, rather than mere acquisition of it. Elena arrived early, as she always did, hoping to avoid the chaos of arrival. She moved through the galleries like she was already a ghost, her presence noted but not felt. She found herself in a smaller room, away from the main gathering, standing before a portrait of a Neapolitan duchess from the 17th century. The woman in the painting had her eyes, that same expression of quiet strength of inner worlds that the external world had no power to touch. Elena was so absorbed in the painting that she did not notice when the atmosphere of the room shifted. She did not notice the way conversations that had been loud suddenly became hushed. She did not notice the subtle adjustment in the air that happened when powerful men entered a space. That particular electricity that comes when everyone suddenly becomes aware of where the real power lies. Alessandro De Luca had arrived. He stood in the doorway between galleries, and even without knowing who he was, Elena could have sensed something different about him. He was not tall, though he carried himself as if height was irrelevant. He had dark hair touched with gray at the temples, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a face that suggested he had seen things that had carved themselves into the lines around his mouth. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, black, understated, the kind of clothing that suggested power did not need to advertise itself. What Elena did not know was that Alessandro De Luca controlled significant portions of Naples through networks of influence that official law enforcement could never quite prove. He had inherited his power from his father and his grandfather before that, men whose names were whispered in certain circles with a mixture of fear and respect. He was a man who could have anything he wanted because the machinery of the city had been constructed, over decades, to give it to him. He had attended this engagement party as a gesture of respect to an old family alliance, a confirmation of loyalty that transcended individual celebration. He was not looking for anything. He certainly was not looking for love. Love was a luxury that men like him could not afford. Love required vulnerability. Love required the possibility of loss. Love required something that Alessandro had lost years ago, if he had ever truly possessed it at all. He moved through the museum with his associates, exchanging greetings with Naples' most powerful families. Gabriella Venturi rushed to greet him, her social radar perfectly calibrated to recognize important arrivals. She introduced him to Marco, her husband, and to several other guests. Alessandro nodded politely, accepted a glass of champagne he would not drink, and began the ritual of conversation that successful men in Naples understood perfectly, the careful negotiation of respect and distance. It was while moving between galleries that he saw her. She was standing alone in front of a portrait, and there was something in her stillness that made him stop. In a room full of people who were constantly performing, constantly positioning themselves for maximum visibility, she was genuinely looking at something. Not seeing, genuinely looking. Her entire being seemed focused on the painting, as if everything else in the world had become irrelevant. Elena turned, feeling the weight of someone's gaze, and for a moment, their eyes met. What happened in that moment was not dramatic. There were no orchestral swells of music, there were no sudden revelations. What happened was simple and profound and entirely real. Two people truly saw each other for the first time. Alessandro saw a woman who was not performing, not positioning, not calculating. He saw someone whose quietness came not from shyness, but from an internal richness that did not require external validation. Elena saw a man whose power was so complete that he did not need to assert it. She saw someone whose storm cloud eyes held a particular kind of loneliness that only other lonely people could recognize. Then, the moment broke. Elena turned back to the painting. Alessandro continued walking. But something had shifted in the architecture of the evening. Elena moved to find a quieter space, somewhere she could be away from the noise and chaos. She discovered a smaller room, a room that seemed less frequented, where display cases held sculptures and ancient artifacts. She stood by a window that looked out onto the museum gardens, watching the city lights begin to appear as evening deepened into night. She was so absorbed in the view that she did not notice when Alessandro entered the room. He stood for a moment in the doorway watching her. She was looking at the city with an expression that suggested she was trying to memorize it, to catalog every light and shadow. Her hands were at her sides, but he noticed something he had not seen before. Her nails were stained with what appeared to be watercolor paint, various colors, blues, greens, yellows, reds, the stains of an artist's hands. He did not approach her. Instead, he stood silently, respecting the sanctity of whatever internal moment she was experiencing. Minutes passed. Neither of them spoke. There was a profound peace in the shared silence, the kind of peace that two lonely people can create simply by existing in proximity to each other, without requiring anything from the encounter. Eventually, Elena sensed his presence. She turned, and when she saw him, recognition flickered across her face. The man from the gallery. The man whose presence had caused the subtle shift in the atmosphere. For the first time that evening, she wondered who he was, but she did not ask. She simply acknowledged his presence with a small nod and turned back to the window. He moved to stand beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could sense his presence like a nearby heartbeat. They stood together in that room filled with ancient artifacts, both of them looking out at the city, both of them understanding without words that this moment existed outside the logic of the party, happening beyond the walls. After several minutes, Alessandro turned and walked away, disappearing back into the sounds and conversations of the main galleries. Elena remained at the window, her heart beating in a way she could not quite explain, her hands trembling slightly though the evening was warm. She did not see Alessandro again that night, but she felt him, the way one feels the presence of someone who has somehow become important, someone whose existence in the world had suddenly affected the trajectory of one's own. As she drove home through the Neapolitan night, she wondered who he was. She wondered if she would ever see him again. She wondered why the feeling of his presence lingered like a melody she could not quite forget. What Elena did not know was that Alessandro had left the party early, something he never did. He had returned to his residence, an ancient palazzo in the heart of Naples, and sat alone in his study with the lights of the city spread before him like a kingdom he had never wanted to rule. He had spent the night thinking about a woman with paint-stained hands and eyes that suggested she understood loneliness in the same way that he did. He had spent the night making a decision that would change both their lives forever. In the weeks that followed the engagement party, Elena returned to her routine with a new awareness that something had shifted, though she could not articulate what. She cared for her mother. She painted in her small room. She attended family dinners where her sisters spoke about their expanding empires. Gabriella's husband had purchased a new hotel in Sicily. Alessia's company had received an investment that valued it at €500 million. Elena listened and smiled and said the appropriate things, and no one noticed that she had entered a new dimension of her own life. The paint-stained hands that had caught Alessandro's attention continued to create. Elena painted the Neapolitan streets she loved, the hidden corners of the city that tourists never discovered, the everyday beauty that existed in the spaces between power and commerce. She painted her mother's hands as they rested on the blanket during her afternoon naps. She painted the way light moved through the mansion at different times of day. She painted her own loneliness with such precision that anyone looking at her work would understand that they were witnessing something essential, something true. Then, 3 weeks after the museum, flowers arrived at the Russo mansion. They were peonies, dozens of them in pale pink, the color of dawn, the color of first love, the color of something tender and vulnerable. There was no card, only the flowers. Elena found them on the front doorstep, wrapped in expensive silk paper, their fragrance filling the entire entrance hall. She stood holding them, her heart racing in a way she could not justify. She told no one. She placed them in a vase in her room and spent hours simply looking at them, trying to understand what they meant, who they could be from. The logical part of her mind suggested they had been delivered to the wrong address. The illogical part, the part she rarely allowed to exist, whispered that they had been sent specifically for her. 2 days later, a handwritten note arrived, also with no return address. The handwriting was precise, educated, the penmanship of someone who had been taught by people who believed that the way one wrote said something fundamental about one's character. The note contained only a question: "Do you paint?" Elena read it 100 times. She held the paper in her hands and tried to decode it like an ancient text that contained the secrets of the universe. She knew somehow who had sent it. The man from the museum. The man with storm cloud eyes. But how could he have known about her paintings? How could he have known about the paint stains on her hands? She did not respond. She placed the note beneath her pillow and continued with her life. Though her life had taken on a new texture, a new awareness that someone was thinking about her, that someone had noticed her, that her invisibility, it seemed, had not been as complete as she had believed. Another week passed. Then on a Tuesday evening when rain was falling softly on Naples, Elena was sitting with her mother, helping her with dinner, when there was a knock at the door. The household staff had been given the evening off. Elena answered it herself. A man stood on the threshold, well-dressed, respectful. He explained in a quiet voice that he had been sent to request that Elena attend a private art exhibition. It would be held the following evening at a gallery in the Vomero district. All details had been arranged, a car would be sent. The time was 7 o'clock. If she preferred not to attend, she need only say so, and nothing more would ever be said about it. Elena's hands trembled as she received the invitation. She did not ask who had sent it, though she knew. The man departed, leaving behind only courtesy and the faintest suggestion of power moving through the world according to specific instructions. That night, Elena did not sleep. She lay in her bed and thought about what it meant to be noticed, what it meant to be chosen, what it meant to step out of the shadows that had defined her entire adult life. The next evening, she told her mother a story, not a lie exactly, but a creative reshaping of reality. She told her she was attending an art exhibition with a friend she had made at a recent community event. Her mother, drowsy from medication, smiled and encouraged her to enjoy herself. Elena dressed carefully in a simple cream-colored dress, applied makeup with more care than she usually did, and waited for the car. The car was a Mercedes, black, with tinted windows. The driver was polite and professional, saying nothing as he navigated through the Neapolitan traffic toward the Vomero. The gallery, when they arrived, was small and exclusive. The kind of place where art was sold to people who understood that true wealth was measured in the ability to appreciate beauty. But Elena quickly realized that the exhibition was not open to the public. The gallery had been closed for the evening. Only one person was inside, standing in front of a series of paintings, and when he turned to see her, Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from the museum. But now, in this private space, without the armor of the party, he seemed somehow more real and more dangerous simultaneously. He was not smiling. His expression was serious, almost grave, as if he was about to propose something that carried significant weight. Alessandro approached her slowly, his movements deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. He told her that he had noticed her at the engagement party, that he had been struck by something about her, a quality he could not quite name. He had made inquiries, careful inquiries that would not draw attention. He had learned that she was Elena Russo, youngest daughter of the Russo family, that she lived quietly, that she cared for her mother, that she painted. He had instructed his associates to find examples of her work. Elena stood frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Someone, this man, this powerful man, had investigated her, had sought out her paintings, had traced the invisible threads of her life. He explained that the paintings he had seen had moved him in a way that art rarely did. They contained a truth that transcended technique or training. They contained a soul. He had closed this gallery specifically to show them to her. An exclusive exhibition, he said, of the work of an artist whose name the world did not yet know, but whose work suggested that the world would someday understand its value. Elena's hands moved to her mouth. She looked around the gallery and saw hanging on the white walls her own paintings, the streets of Naples she had painted, the hands of her mother, the light moving through the mansion, the study she had painted of loneliness that she had never shown anyone, that had been hanging in her room for months. How had he obtained them? How was this possible? But before she could speak, Alessandro continued. He told her that he had seen in her paintings something that he recognized in himself, a particular understanding of the world that came from standing apart from it, from seeing things as they truly were, rather than as they appeared to be. He told her that in her work he had recognized a kindred soul, and that recognition had changed something fundamental in him. He asked her if she would consider allowing him to support her work, to provide her with resources to paint freely, without the burden of needing to care for her mother alone, though he assured her that her mother would receive the best medical care available. He was offering her not charity but recognition, recognition of the value of what she created, recognition of the value of who she was. Elena felt the world shift beneath her feet. She felt the careful architecture of her invisible life begin to crumble. She tried to speak, but words failed her. Then Alessandro moved closer, and when he spoke again, his voice contained something she had not expected: vulnerability. He told her that he was not a good man. He told her that his life had been built on things that she would not approve of, on structures of power that operated in shadows and in the spaces where official law could not reach. He told her that he had learned, long ago, to armor himself against feeling, against the possibility of genuine human connection. But looking at her paintings, standing in that museum gallery weeks ago, he had been confronted with the reality that despite all his armor, he was still capable of being moved by something true. He asked her if she would consider spending time with him, not as his employee, not as someone he was patronizing, but as someone who had somehow impossibly become important to him, someone whose presence in the world had affected the trajectory of his own. Elena's eyes filled with tears. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever suggested that she was worth pursuing, worth protecting, worth changing one's life for. But standing in that gallery, looking at paintings that had been created in her solitude, she understood that she had been reaching out all along, through her art, through her careful observations of the world, through her love for her mother, through every invisible gesture of tenderness and witness that her life had contained. She said yes. The word came out small and uncertain, but it came out. Yes. In the 3 months that followed, Elena's life transformed in ways she could not have imagined. Alessandro moved carefully, with a respect that suggested he understood the fragility of something newly begun. He was patient. He was genuine. He was not the dangerous man that the whispered stories in Naples suggested. Or rather, he was exactly that man. But that dangerousness existed in a completely different dimension than the one Elena occupied. He arranged for the best medical care for her mother, bringing in specialists who managed her condition with such skill that Maria began to experience days of genuine comfort and clarity that she had not known in years. He set up a studio for Elena in a separate section of his palazzo, a vast space with northern light and every material an artist could desire. He supported her work not with intrusion but with presence. He would sometimes sit quietly in the corner of her studio while she painted, offering nothing but his attention, his witnessing of her work. But more than that, he introduced her to a world she did not know existed. He took her to galleries where artists discussed the philosophy of beauty. He brought her to the homes of collectors who had spent lifetimes studying art history. He showed her that the skills she had developed in isolation had value in the larger conversation about aesthetics and meaning that the world conducted in certain circles. Most importantly, He treated her as someone whose opinion mattered. He asked her questions about her life, about her paintings, about her thoughts on things that had nothing to do with art or beauty. He listened in the way that the most powerful people listen, with complete attention, as if the person speaking was the only thing in the world that existed. Her sisters noticed the change almost immediately. At the family dinner that Alessandro attended for the first time, walking beside Elena with his hand at the small of her back, Gabriella and Alessia exchanged looks that contained confusion, envy, and a growing realization that something had occurred that they had not anticipated. Their youngest sister, the invisible one, had somehow become attached to one of Naples' most powerful men. The questions came quickly. Who was he? Where had Elena met him? What was the nature of their relationship? Elena answered simply and honestly. She did not elaborate. She did not perform. She simply told them that Alessandro was someone she cared about, and that he cared about her. She watched as her sisters processed this information, watched as they tried to understand how their forgotten sister had somehow managed to acquire something that all their wealth and connections had taught them to value above all else: the attention and protection of a powerful man. But Elena had learned something that her sisters had not. She had learned that true power did not reside in the wealth of one's husband or the size of one's engagement ring. True power resided in being genuinely seen by another person, in mattering not because of what one could offer in terms of connections or social standing, but simply because one existed. The months passed. Spring came to Naples and the city transformed into something softer, something more forgiving. Elena painted during the days, her work becoming richer and more confident as she discovered that she had permission to create without apology. She spent her evenings with Alessandro, and in the privacy of his ancient palazzo, she discovered that the armor she thought was essential to surviving in the world was something she no longer needed to wear. Her mother's health stabilized. The best specialists in Europe had brought her condition into a state of manageable equilibrium. Maria had moved into a beautiful suite within Alessandro's palazzo, her own apartments filled with natural light and the sounds of the city she loved. She had begun to understand, with the particular wisdom of mothers, that something significant was occurring in her youngest daughter's life. Then came the engagement party for Vittoria, the same event that had begun this entire sequence of events 3 months earlier, though now the meaning of the evening had shifted entirely. The party was to be held again at the Capodimonte Museum, and this time it was Vittoria and her fiancé who were being celebrated. But everyone in Naples knew that this party would be remembered for something else entirely. Alessandro prepared Elena carefully, but not because he wanted to transform her. He wanted to present her as she was, but presented fully, completely, without apology. A designer created a gown specifically for her, a creation in white silk that moved like water, and that managed to be simultaneously simple and extraordinary. Her mother's pearl earrings remained at her ears. Her dark hair was styled loosely, allowing it to fall across her shoulders in waves. Her hands, still stained faintly with watercolor, remained ungloved. As they arrived at the museum, conversation stopped. The elite of Naples, the people who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of wealth and power and established hierarchy, sensed that something unusual was about to occur. Elena moved through the galleries with Alessandro beside her, no longer invisible, no longer attempting to disappear into the background. She was present. She was claimed. She was valued. The moment came during the formal celebration, after the engagement had been toasted and the evening had reached its ceremonial peak. The room was full of Naples' most influential families, gathered in the main gallery with its soaring ceilings and Renaissance masterpieces. Cameras were prepared to capture the final moments of the official celebration. Alessandro excused himself briefly, took Elena's hand and led her to the center of the room. The conversation stopped. The air shifted. Everyone recognized what was about to happen before it happened. He lowered himself onto one knee, a man whose power was so complete that kneeling was not a gesture of weakness but of choice. He knelt before Elena, and as he did, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He spoke words that only she could hear, but the act itself was public, unambiguous, and revolutionary in its implications. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring. Not ostentatious, not designed to announce wealth and status, but beautiful in the way that true beauty often is, suggesting depth and authenticity rather than mere expense. He asked her, in front of Naples' entire elite, if she would marry him. Elena's hands went to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. And she said yes, not the small, uncertain yes she had offered in the gallery 3 months earlier, but a clear, certain, joyful yes that echoed through the room like a proclamation. The room erupted, but Elena barely heard it. She was looking at the man kneeling before her, this powerful man, this dangerous man, this man who had chosen to announce his love in the most public way possible, in front of everyone who had ever doubted her, everyone who had overlooked her, everyone who had assumed that her invisibility was permanent. As the cameras flashed and the celebrations began, Elena looked up at the Renaissance paintings surrounding them, the martyrs and saints and nobles who had been immortalized in pigment and canvas centuries ago. She understood, in that moment, that she too had been given a kind of immortality, not through accident of birth or wealth or connection, but through being genuinely loved, being genuinely seen, being genuinely chosen. Her sisters stood in the crowd, and for the first time in their lives, Elena felt something other than the old envy and inadequacy that had defined her childhood. She felt compassion for them. She understood that they had obtained what they thought they wanted: powerful husbands, vast wealth, social prominence, but that they had not obtained what truly mattered. They had not been seen. They had been acquiring merchandise, not seeking connection. As Alessandro placed the ring on her finger and pulled her into an embrace, Elena thought of her mother, watching from a nearby seat, tears of pride and recognition streaming down her face. She thought of the paintings she had created in solitude, the observations and insights that had been born from her invisibility. She thought of the paint stains on her hands that had caught his attention, that had suggested to him that she was someone real, someone true, someone worth knowing. The party continued around them. Champagne flowed. Music played. But Elena and Alessandro existed in a smaller circle, a private universe within the public one. He looked at her with an expression that contained such complete recognition, such absolute certainty, that she understood finally what had drawn him to her in the first place. It was not her beauty, though he found her beautiful. It was not her circumstances, though her devotion to her mother had shown him something about character that wealth could never purchase. It was simply that she was real. In a world of performance and masks and careful social calculation, she was genuine. As the evening deepened and the celebration continued, Elena found herself standing again at one of the museum windows, the same window where she had stood 3 months earlier. She was no longer alone, but the solitude she had known was not erased. It was integrated. It had become part of her depth, her ability to understand nuance and meaning, her skill at witnessing the world with honesty. Alessandro appeared beside her, and they stood together, looking out at Naples, the city where she had been invisible, the city where she had been overlooked, the city where she had learned to create meaning in solitude. And now she would inhabit this city differently, not as someone hiding in the shadows, but as someone who had been brought fully into the light by someone who had recognized in her something that all her family's wealth had failed to appreciate. The camera flashes continued inside the museum, immortalizing the moment. By tomorrow morning, the headlines would proclaim the engagement of Alessandro De Luca, one of Naples's most powerful men, to Elena Russo, the youngest daughter of an old family, an artist whose paintings would soon become sought after by collectors across Europe. The story would be told in a certain way, the way powerful love stories are always told in the press. But the true story, the real story, was simpler and more profound. It was a story about a woman who had learned to see the world clearly because she had spent so much time being overlooked. A story about a man who had accumulated power and discovered that power was meaningless without someone genuine to share it with. It was a story about how invisibility, when transformed by love and recognition, could become the most luminous thing of all. As Elena's hands, once stained with watercolor paint, now catch the light with an engagement ring that represents not wealth, but recognition, her invisible life has become unforgettable. If you've been moved by Elena's journey, by the truth that sometimes those we overlook contain the greatest beauty, that quiet strength speaks louder than any proclamation, that being seen by one person can transform everything, then this story has served its purpose, but there are more stories waiting to be told. Stories of transformation. Stories of people who lived in shadows and discovered they were meant to shine. Stories of love that sees truly, power that respects genuinely, and lives that change completely when someone decides to notice. Subscribe to our channel now and join us for more stories that will remind you that invisibility is never permanent. It's simply the price we sometimes pay for depth, authenticity, and the kind of beauty that cannot be manufactured, only discovered. Don't miss the next chapter in the lives of people whose stories matter. Subscribe now, because sometimes the greatest love story is the one where someone finally looks and truly sees.